Hello and welcome to this episode of Philosophy for All. I'm your host Joshua Yan, and today we're greatly privileged to be joined by Dr. Sebastian Ostritsch at Heidelberg University to talk about the philosophy of Hegel. He has written 4 books ranging from Hegel, the World Philosopher, to the ethics of computer gaming, and he specializes in, of course, Hegel of metaethics and also some recent interests in Thomism and the 5 ways. So get started off with Hegel. Can you start off by telling us how he contextualizes in this German movement, especially in relation to Kant?
So, first of all, let me say I'm very happy and grateful to be on your channel, and I look forward to sharing what I know about Hegel. So, yes, your question is quite correct insofar as as far as you point towards Kant when we start to think and talk about Hegel's philosophy. So Kant is the intellectual giant that Hegel encounters when he starts studying philosophy and also theology at now we would say university, but it was a religious institution, religious university-like institution in Tübingen, alongside with other famous or later to be famous German intellectuals, such as the German poet Hölderlin and another big giant of classical German philosophy, namely Schelling. So there, already in his formative student years, he encounters the philosophy of Kant, and he's fascinated by it, just as his fellow students are. And the main theme of Kant's philosophy is, I would say, freedom. And so there is this, of course, a certain Enlightenment tradition there that culminates in Kant. But Kant thinks of freedom in a very specific way. For Kant, freedom is not arbitrariness or liberty in the sense of not being restricted by anything. Rather, freedom is a notion of self-determination, of binding yourself freely to certain norms that you regard as reasonable. Or you could actually say to be reasonable is to be truly free for Kant. And so for Kant to be free and to follow what he terms the categorical imperative, so this very strict moral rule, is not a contradiction, because for us it might seem like that if we are used to a different notion of freedom, namely freedom as arbitrariness or license or something like that. So Hegel is fascinated with this notion of freedom, of course, in the area of practical philosophy, but this notion of freedom is also present in Kant's theoretical philosophy, because Kant revolutionized his approach to philosophy, or to understanding the world, insofar as Kant claimed that we need to look into the subjects to find out the true objective structures of reality. So this sounds like might sound like some form of subjectivism, but this would be unfair against Kant, because for Kant, the world is not an imagination or something just merely constructed, if you like. But for Kant, the objective nature of reality is somehow imposed by our structure of subjectivity. So there is an objective world, and there's also something that is independent from us. But the structure of that, which we encounter, for example, in the laws of nature, is on a fundamental level, structured by our categories, but also by our senses, or the fundamental structure of our senses. So of our understanding of time and space. Well, not only of our understanding, but of our form of space and time that, according to Kant, we somehow impose, or this is kind of like the filter through which we receive reality. And so where does freedom figure in that? Well, where all these subjective structures unite is, for Kant, the I, so self-consciousness. And this I, or self-consciousness, is not the empirical I that changes all the time. So the I that you can identify with certain snapshots of yourself, through time, but it is if you like, almost logical notion. That is the I that you can always add to everything everything you think, you say, you believe. You can also always say I think, do, or want, or whatever, this or that. And and this I has a synthetic function. Yeah, it synthesizes all those subjective categories and structures, and this action of the I, if you like, this transcendental unity which the I is responsible for, is, since it's an act of itself, it is something we could call also freedom, in the sense of self-determination, if you like. So there you have this notion of freedom reappearing again, also in his theoretical philosophy. So this was very vague and broad. I hope it was somewhat understandable. But this double function of self-determination in practical philosophy as well as in theoretical philosophy is what fascinates Hegel, and on which he then builds his own thinking. Now, we have to probably counterbalance this Kantian approach with another huge figure that is not a contemporary of Hegel's, but someone who got how would say, intellectually rediscovered in his age, namely Spinoza. So Spinoza became a big name through the German intellectual figure Lessing, who was supposedly a secret Spinosist, which was quite a big scandal because Spinocism was somehow associated with pantheism or atheism even. And what fascinated Hegel regarding Spinoza was Spinoza's thinking of the absolute as an all-encompassing unity. So this is what you would probably want to associate with pantheism, but I think that's probably too simple. But still, so there's this Greek notion of hen kai pan, the all one. And so to think of the absolute as something that does not have anything outside of it, and combining this with Kant's notion of freedom as self-determination, to bring those two seemingly quite different perspectives together is, I think, what makes Hegel's project so unique and so interesting.
That's quite fascinating. The way you tie in Spinoza to Kant is something which I'm sure we'll develop a bit more on in the remaining part of this interview, especially Spinoza's idea, I suppose, of modes, different modes of the absolute. These things will, I suppose, come into play even further. However, taking a step back and turning to Hegel's project, can you tell us a bit more about how he then decides to take on these ideas of Kant and tries to develop upon it? I suppose when you read Hegel, he's trying to create this presuppositionalist philosophy in some sense. Can you tell us a bit more about the goals of his project?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So you already mentioned the idea of presuppositionalist thinking. And in a certain sense, this is taking up Kant's critical project. So what is Kant's critical project? Well, he thought that before we start doing ontology or metaphysics, we have to be clear about how we do it. What are actually our presuppositions, if you like, to doing something like ontology and metaphysics. And Kant then started to thinking about the categories of our thinking and so on, all those things that led to what I just sketched. And but the problem with Kant from a Hegelian perspective is that he really never got out of subjectivity, if you like. So if he somehow stuck in subjectivity, because for Kant, obviously, there was a big problem. According to him, you could not tell what the thing in itself is like. You could actually not even say anything about the thing in itself. So meaning the thing that the world as it is, totally independent from our subjective categories and our forms of intuition. And this was quite unsatisfying for Hegel, this kind of skeptical outlook. And so what he then tried to do is somehow do justice to skepticism, but in the end overcome it and come to a really truly a metaphysical view of the world. So this is actually Hegel's project then, to be skeptical and overcome skepticism, like somehow fight skepticism with its own weapons. And the way he tried to achieve this goal, well, differs when you look at his early work or than his later work. So I would say the first big attempt to do something like this is the Phenomenology of Spirit, which he wrote in his days when he taught at Jena University, and then later you could say that he somehow integrated some parts of that work, but he really, I would say, changed his approach. And then the first big new way for him of developing this project is the Science of Logic, which is two volumes. And from then on, he developed a system, and now you can read this, at least the outlines of that system, in his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. So now we would have to look either into the Phenomenology of Spirit, or I would say the Science of Logic, to understand maybe the differences of his approach. Yeah.
So perhaps let us first look into the Phenomenology of Spirit, and then we can delve into the Science of Logic. And I suppose central to both of them is, I guess, a question of consciousness and how that's conceived. Can you tell us a bit more about consciousness, I suppose, first in the Phenomenology of Spirit, and then we can talk about that, how that's presented in a different way in the Science of Logic.
Oh yeah, okay. So in the Phenomenology of Spirit, consciousness is pretty much the key concept. And now the idea is, again, to be as presuppositionless as you can be. And so Hegel wants to understand, if you like, wants to find the correct relationship between subjectivity and objectivity, between subject and object. And he thinks he can find that if he, pretty much like Kant, asks consciousness itself, or analyzes consciousness itself. But with what he starts is like a minimalist version of consciousness, which he calls in German natürliches Bewusstsein, which you translate as natural consciousness. And this is the name for, if you like, our even pre-philosophical everyday mode of like understanding how a subject relates to an object. Now, if you depending on what kind of philosophy you want to defend, you would probably say that, well, what he then develops is an absolute straw man of natural consciousness. And you might think that, but you would then misunderstand Hegel, because this term natural consciousness really stands for something like the logically most minimalist form of consciousness that we could think of. And this is something where an I says just, well, identifies objects, not even as objects, but as like this here. Okay, so just like by pointing this here. And then Hegel asks, well, is something like this consistent? Can we think of, identifying objects like this here? And this is the easiest thing to do, right? Just point at something and say this here, and then you know what you're talking about, or what you're thinking about, what you're referring to. So how you as a consciousness can refer to something. So if you like, consciousness in the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit is always like is the name, the word, the term for a certain theory of intentionality, almost, if you like. And he starts out with a minimalist theory of intentionality. And what Hegel then tries to show is that this minimalist notion of intentionality, of consciousness, actually does not work out. So he says it's actually not possible to successfully refer to objects simply by saying this here, because, well, then you would have to say, well, which this here? There are so many things you have, and then you have to understand also that things change and that there's time. And so obviously it's not enough to be like just to point at something and say this here. There seems to be much more going on when we do that successfully. So, for example, we also refer to certain properties of things, and then we bundle those properties, and then we say, well, those properties change. There are only accidents, but there seems to be something of a substantial nature. And so you see already like all these philosophical categories developing to explain how we refer successfully to something. But as soon as you introduce now a category like one of those categories I just mentioned, you're already beyond that minimalist conception of consciousness, of that what you started out with. Then Hegel says, well, okay, obviously this notion of consciousness has to change. So now we have to enrich our notion of consciousness and say, okay, consciousness is actually more complex, how it refers to something in the world, and then you start out with a new consciousness. Well, for example, you refer to properties or something, but then again you notice that you notice the same thing according to Hegel. You have to again enrich your theory with certain categories that you didn't include in the beginning, just in order to be consistent. So his goal is just to come up with a consistent theory of intentionality. And he finds out that you have to keep adding certain categories to make things work. And at a certain point, well, consciousness somehow realizes that actually it has to understand itself as self-consciousness, like there has to be a self-referential aspect to consciousness to be successful in relating to itself and something that is other than itself. And then again, as you have a new chapter then discussing self-consciousness, and then many different ways of how to understand self-consciousness. And always the move is to start with as little presuppositions as possible, and then if that does not work, you have to enrich. It's like a philosophical trial and error method, if you like. And you could call that dialectics, probably, in the context of the phenomenology of spirit. So that's the general notion of consciousness and how it then develops. And maybe just one more thing to add to that. At a certain point, then Hegel develops the thesis that actually we can't, this whole notion of consciousness and objects, and how the subject refers to those objects, or that world of objects, is not even thinkable without a plurality of subjects, a we. Okay, so, and this we, this is not some abstract philosophical we, but this is a we that lives like in a social setting. It's a society. And then he starts incorporating if you like, also like political philosophy or even ethics or philosophy or religion into his Phenomenology of Spirit. And at this very point, when the we enters into the game of this conceptual development, and then Hegel speaks of spirit. So that is his shorthand, if you like, for an I that has realized that it is interconnected with a we, and that the I is all that the we then, of course, is also conceptually interconnected with the plurality of I's, and so on. Yeah, so that very roughly is the phenomenology of spirit. Yeah.
That's really wonderful, and I think you've touched on a lot of things that we'll slowly get into more. You use some terms like category, self-consciousness, spirit. We'll get back to them very promptly. But before we do so, I was just wondering how similar that structure and that development of consciousness is in the science of logic. Is it still a very much similar procession?
Oh no, it's totally different. So if you like, the phenomenology of spirit is like a prelude to the science of logic. And so so at the very end of the phenomenology of spirit, there's supposed to be this realization that there is no ontological divide between the categories of thinking and the categories of being. So if you think about thinking not on a psychological level, but on a like fundamental level, on a categorical level, then you are also thinking about the structures of reality. So if you like, at the end of the phenomenology of spirit, there's like, okay, we can do metaphysics now, because we have understood that there is no divide between, well, the things as they appear to us and a thing in itself that we somehow cannot grasp through our thinking. Now, this is a very, very tough road to walk to get to that realization. And so, and fortunately, as readers of Hegel, you don't have to fight your way through the phenomenology of spirit to get to that realization, even on Hegelian terms, because he offers if you like, a shortcut, a radical shortcut to the beginning of the science of logic, to this realization. So what he does is to take seriously the idea of thinking without presuppositions. And for Hegel, this means, well, if we really want to think without presuppositions, then even the category of consciousness of a subject and the idea that there's a subject that has to relate to an object, it's already it's such huge presupposition already, if you like. So of course, empirically, you could say, well, it's not, it's just everyday experience. But Hegel's aim, and maybe I didn't mention that yet, or didn't say it explicitly, his idea of philosophy is really something to be done a priori. So can we do a priori philosophy without any presuppositions? And if we take that seriously, well, we cannot even say that there is consciousness, or ask this question of how it relates to reality. We just have to, well, that's the question. What do we do? What do we do? And Hegel says, well, it's simple. We just start thinking. Well, start thinking with what? And he says, well, what do we have? Just start with the beginning. If we get rid of everything, we have like no determinations. Like, that's his name for, any logical anything, if you like. So a logical determination. Do we have anything like that? No. So we have to start with something that is totally undetermined. And what else can we say? Well, it's not mediated in any way, because we have not taken any steps to get here, but we just get rid of any logical mediation with pure immediacy. unmediated, and undetermined. And so what's that? Well, it's just, Hegel says, thatness. Well, he does not say thatness. He says being, but what he means is thatness. So it's not what something is or how something is. It's just the pure thatness of being, or being in its thatness. And there you have your first category of the science of logic. And well, then of course immediately things get tricky, because Hegel then claims, okay, well, but wait a minute, if it's really undeterminate and unmediated, can't we just, well, it's actually nothing, right? It's like nothingness. So how would you even like make a difference between being and nothingness? And well, suddenly you realize, well, it's difficult to make to say what the difference between being and nothingness is without making a certain determination. So giving a character of whatness to any of those two. But you don't want to do that, because you just started out with being is exactly not what something is, or even something. It's just thatness. But thatness and nothingness seem to be somewhat interchangeable, but at the same time, it's clear that they're like radically different. So there you have your first, if you like, contradiction or apparent like logical conflict, if you like, that then somehow motivates a whole, again, development of categories, or like enrichment of categories, where, and now this is the parallel to the Phenomenology of Spirit, where Hegel claims that by thinking through, just merely thinking through these categories and trying to think if they can like explain thinking on themselves, or if they can like explain themselves by themselves, if they can stand on their own, if you like, logically. Hegel claims, no, you need other categories to understand actually what being is. You need more categories to understand what nothing is. And you need the category of becoming. Then later he says, well, you can't understand what becoming is really without understanding what something is. And then you have already a more, well, concrete, if you like, notion of logical notion. And this continues on and on until Hegel claims to develop the entire network of categories that make up our thinking, but then also, of course, reality or the world. So, and in this sense, consciousness does not even figure at all in the science of logic. Yeah. So this
That's quite fascinating. And one of the things you touched on in the start of your exposition on the science of logic, which is quite interesting, is that he's trying to argue that the structures of being or the categories of being are very similar to the structure and categories of thinking. And that is the one way in which I suppose he tries to develop upon that Kantian idea of, oh, we just have the categories of thinking. We don't really know what being is in itself. Can you perhaps tell us a bit more about how he's trying to use, or how he knows that the structure of being is similar to the structure of thinking? Is that a contingent relation? Is it a necessary relation? How do these interact?
Well, I think in the beginning, it's really just like, well, we don't even question we don't even make we don't even allow for the difference of thinking and being. Okay, we just start with like thinking, and we don't reflect on the fact, oh, we're thinking or something, but it's just like we're just looking at the content of thinking, and we just look at the content of our a priori thinking experiment, if you like. We start out with ontological notions, namely being and nothing and becoming and so on and so on. And at a certain point then in this development, there is something like a split into subjectivity and objectivity, but that comes quite late, actually, in his in the science of logic, namely in the very last part, the logic of the Logik des Begriffs in German, so the logic of the concept. And the concept in this weird singular form, which Hegel uses it, means something like the structure of subjectivity, if you like. And then you have so the difference between subject and object is only introduced later to this thinking at all. So if you like, he flips the way we think about things he reverts it, because usually we ask, well, there is this split between the subject and object, and how do we get those together? And he says, well, no, let's just start with thinking, and then we see how these two necessarily, well, not come apart, but how this relation develops, and then we can also understand how they connect. So if you like, the solution to the problem, I'll try to, because it's really quite complex, I would say, but I'll try to put it as simply as I can. So Hegel's main idea is that the structure of reality as such, the fundamental ontological principle, is that which we know from self-consciousness. So, namely, self-negation, or, well, sometimes he also suggests just negativity. Well, what does he mean by that? Okay, so Hegel thinks something like this: being an I is quite a unique thing, because you, insofar as you are free, you make decisions that alter who you are. Like I was not the one giving this interview before I have given it. Okay, so by deciding to come onto your show, I have made myself, in this very unspectacular way, into something which I was not. All right. But by making myself into someone who I was not, or something which I was not, I did not give up being myself or something. No, it's just precisely what I am, what makes me a self-conscious being in this Kantian Hegelian sense, is negating what I am, and through, like, right now, and by negating what I am, becoming what I am. And this, if you like, process of self-negation, which is the same as self-determination, because by negating something, I'm also determining myself. This is like a logical principle of that Spinoza was very fond of. So omnis negatio determinatio est. Okay, so if this is the structure of being an I, of being free, well, Hegel says this is precisely also the structure of the concept in this ontological sense, the fundamental ontological principle of reality. And the I that you and I are, so the empirical, persons made of flesh and blood, we are embodiments of this logical ontological principle. And since we are ontologically the same, okay, there's no surprise that the way that we think and that reality somehow fits, because we are, if you like, the exemplary being, or the being that exemplifies the very structure of reality in a self-conscious way. So
that's quite fascinating. Yeah, and I'm sure, and perhaps a helpful way to develop this a bit more. Do you think it is a good time to jump to his metaphysics in some sense? So think about how the self engages with the underlying ground of being, I suppose. And I guess Spinoza likes to put the self as almost this mode on this wave of ocean, and we're just kind of one drop on this wave of ocean. Is that metaphysics kind of a helpful concept to develop upon this tool right now, do you think?
Well, I think Spinoza, so for Hegel is, as I already mentioned, a huge, fan and avid reader of Spinoza, but in his Science of Logic, he also, so he does not work in a historical sense in the way that he engages with certain historical texts, like explicitly, but the logical categories, or if you like, philosophical worldviews, which he walks through in his Science of Logic, always correspond or tend to correspond to certain real historical philosophies. And one of them is Spinoza. And Spinoza comes like right before Hegel starts to develop his notion of the concept. So what I just tried to explain. And so for Hegel, the problem with Spinoza is that he somehow understood the all unity of reality, but he could not understand like that there is or his notion of substance was just like that of a single substance. Okay, and then you have modes and so on. But for Hegel, like persons are like real. Actually, persons are the real thing. Yeah. So it's not like there is some transpersonal spirit, which is which has the certain ontological structure and which is, the true being or something like that. No. Reality is such that it necessarily, due to its inherent structure, brings forth beings, self-conscious thinking beings of the kind that we are. And so we are really free individuals. We are really persons, and we're just not just some epiphenomena of what reality really is, of some divine substance or like something like that. So that is not Hegel's view, and for that he thinks that, well, indeed Spinoza tends a little bit into that direction. And so again, this is what this is what makes this brings me back to what I said at the beginning. This is the very point where he wants to do justice to Kant's insights. A individual persons as self-determinate beings, and also with this has implications, so obviously for practical philosophy then. So this I would say is where he differs from Spinoza mainly.
So we've talked a bit about conscious, and you also talked about how that consciousness develops into self-consciousness. I suppose this is more, it seems, a concept in the phenomenology than the science of logic. But can you perhaps tell us a bit more about how that self-consciousness arises out of consciousness in this scheme of things?
All right. Well, so that is, I think, I think this is the most difficult chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit. I would say. It's because it hinges on a certain notion of understanding, which is really, I think no one has really understood that chapter at all. So this is why I also said before that the phenomenology of spirit is luckily you don't have to fight your way through it. So just a quick anecdote: when Hegel, when he was, I think, in 1 year or the year of his death, so quite late in his life, he was asked to do a new edition of the Phenomenology of Spirit, and he wrote this little note, which we still have, where it says, well, it's something like an unrefined work of youth, do not revise. So he thought like, well, it's an interesting document of my younger self, but I'm not going to put any effort into fixing that. It's just not fixable. Okay, so that's that. But what I think makes sense to talk about, or what can be talked about, is how self-consciousness arises according to Hegel, self-consciousness in the sense, in a robust sense. And Hegel thinks that on the most rudimentary level, you even have to think of consciousness almost like an animal consciousness, of something of more like a practical awareness. So the scenario he paints there is, you have beings that interact with the world and that know themselves by showing their dominance over the things that they encounter. So you can just manipulate things, or you can just eat stuff. So really he thinks really physically. So not like something you would say that an idealist does, but he's really very well, I would say empirical in this sense, that he like thinks of us as really as beings of bodily beings. There's even well, I would say it's a joke, but still it's a philosophical joke of saying that all animals are idealists, because by devouring devouring things, they prove that they are actually nothing, or that they're just nothing stable or ontologically substantial, but they can be eliminated or taken up into the subject in that way. Okay, so you have that. So you have a certain awareness of when you like satisfy something, a certain need, or when you incorporate something into your sphere, if as it were. And now this is obviously quite a fleeting notion of awareness. We can imagine something like this for animals, but Hegel says to be something more stable, in order for consciousness to be something more stable, this only comes up when there is a certain type of interaction, namely an interaction, he says, between two beings that somehow this is the famous master and slave dialectics. Okay, so he says, well, if two beings suddenly start to both claim that they are actually somehow masters of their environment, well, what happens then? And Hegel says, well, if in this fight for like dominance that there is one winner and one that subordinates himself to that winner, you have something like which he calls master-slave dialectic. And now the idea is that the slave, by being forced to do chores which do not serve his immediate needs or desires, is actually on a better route to become fully self-conscious, or to be self-conscious in a higher manner. Why is that? Because the servant or the slave learns how to master his own immediate desires and promptings and so on, and to distance himself from that. To, if you like, it's a how do you call it? If you postpone the gratifications that you can have now, and somehow the slave is forced to postpone those gratifications, but the master is not. And by like putting this difference between his immediate promptings, if you like, natural promptings, he develops a relationship. He gains a relationship not only to the master but to himself. So, and this is for Hegel like the moment this happens, that human beings are able to distance themselves from themselves. This is where something like truly self-consciousness arises. Now you can read this as like a story for humankind itself. You can also read this as a story of the individual development, so ontogenesis as well as phylogenesis. And but I think the main point is really a structural one, namely that to be self-consciousness, you have to be able to orient yourself towards certain higher instances and norms, and only then you gain something that is a stable self-consciousness that is not dependent on your momentary feelings or ways of awareness or whatever. Yeah, so this is the story, the philosophical story, I would call it, that Hegel tells for the development of something like self-consciousness in a robust sense.
Mm-hmm. And does this structure of self-consciousness, or this development of knowledge, find its way into the science of logic and his later works, or is this almost development of knowledge?
In his later works, then in the Encyclopedia. So you would have like his later system. Hegel himself calls it a circle of circles. Okay, so the idea is that every part of the system has like a circular a circular structure, not of course it's not supposed to be a vicious circle, but it's like a circle of, if you like, explicating all your presuppositions until you've come full circle and you really understand the point from where you started. Okay, where you have like really what, like it's like a reflection loop, if you like. Okay, and so this is it for the science of logic, where in the end you again see how the structure of that is that becomes embodied in the human eye, if you like, is also the one already operating from the very beginning of the science of logic. And then you have like completed one circle. But then for Hegel, it's clear, okay, there is more to reality than just this logical aspect to it, or ontological in this fundamental categorical way, but there's also seems to be something that is other than the logical, and this he calls nature, something where this logical or rational, let's say a rational structure, because it's not about formal logics, so in any of the and well, in all of my previous explanations when I said logic, Hegel does not think about formal logic, but like would say structures of rationality, something like ontological structures or something like that. Okay, so but he thinks that there is something to reality which is in a certain sense more, or the other of the logical structure, which he calls nature. And this is really interesting because in nature we say we have a certain view of nature that is well, there's somehow laws of nature, of course, so there's an intelligible structure to nature, but at the same time nature is also like quite chaotic, and things there's something like contingency, which in the merely a priori sphere of what Hegel calls the logical, it's not there. There's no contingency there. But in nature, well, things just, there's things like chance, but there are also laws or intelligibility. And so he tries then to understand this, and that's if you like the second circle is the philosophy of nature. And having thought through nature, he then comes to that point of nature where nature understands itself, and that is where consciousness arises. And then you have the third circle, which is the philosophy of spirit within the encyclopedic system. And the philosophy of spirit is then, if you like, the place in a system where he reiterates all those questions or topics that he already discussed in the Phenomenology of Spirit, but with a somewhat different method. And there you have, again, he talks about consciousness, self-consciousness, but then he also talks about ethics, philosophy of right in a more narrow sense, like philosophy of jurisprudence, if you like, the political philosophy, philosophy of religion, philosophical aesthetics, or philosophy of art, maybe, and then even what we today would call philosophy of philosophy, so meta philosophy. And then, of course, meta philosophy is the philosophy of philosophy is the highest point in a system. Then you can already see, well, if you really have understood what philosophy is, then according to Hegel, you'd come back again, you come again full circle, and then you can start afresh with the science of logic. Like you understand now even deeper what you did when you started your logical project. Yeah, so this is roughly the idea of how spirit reappears, or these topics of consciousness, self-consciousness, and spirit reappear in his later works.
Perhaps this is a good time to introduce or talk about the concept of dialectics. And I think this is perhaps one of the areas where I guess Hegel gets quoted a lot. They're like, oh, it's thesis, antithesis, and whatnot, when that's not really exactly how I suppose Hegel ought to be understood when it comes to dialectics. But dialectics is very much the process of how Hegel views this development of understanding. Can you tell us a bit more about dialectics and how we should interpret this framework of dialectics?
Yeah. So first of all, I think what you said is already well, probably the main point to take away is that it's not like a like this triplet of like thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and there's just simply no line in Hegel's entire work where he would define dialectics in such a way. So it's really interesting how that got how this idea got introduced. Actually, he says that Kant thinks in this threefold, in this three-step process. So, and he says that kind of reproachful towards Kant. So, which is quite funny when well, it's typically now Hegel that gets connected and criticized for this. And I would say even Fichte, the early Fichte, there you find something very much of like thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in his philosophy, in his Wissenschaftslehre. But for Hegel, this is just simply not true. What you do have is very often a numbering of threes, and that's true. And there's also a certain sense in which you can then, if you've really walked through Hegel, say, of course, there is something like this three-step in there, but it's really not helpful to start with that, because, so here's the reason why it's not helpful, because if Hegel did that in the phenomenology, in the science of logic, he would undermine his entire project of thinking a priori without presuppositions, because the idea that the method of philosophy consists of such a three-step, that's a huge presupposition you would first have to prove. And so this cannot be the way that Hegel operates. Okay, so what then is dialectics? I think in a minimal sense dialectics is just unfolding a thought or a concept, just like conceptually laying open, explicating a concept internally without like the use of other concepts, trying to do that. So taking, if you like, a concept to its extreme, in the sense that you really try to capture totality with this concept, if you like, or with a certain idea, and then you look how far you get and where this takes you. And what is dialectical about that is that, according to Hegel, if you try to do that, at a certain point, you notice that you have to introduce a different concept to explicate the one that you're dealing with. And in this sense of like the first concept, then, if you like, changes or transforms is not correct, but somehow leads to, if you like, leads to a different concept, another concept, which then you can say is its opposite, its negation in a certain sense. And then you look at that concept, and then again you have the same realization. Maybe you don't, but for Hegel, dialectics is just like, let's try that, explicate a concept, and look where it leads us. And then bit by bit you see that obviously it's Hegel's claim that there is something like a conceptual enrichment that is necessitated by the very concepts that you're looking at. And this is all that there is to dialectics in the beginning, I would say. And when you look back at the end, you could say, okay, dialectics is somehow a movement of self-negation. And then remember what I tried to say about being an I, according to Hegel, and being what you are means becoming something that you are not yet. Okay, and so being is like negating yourself and determining yourself by negating yourself. If you say this is, if you look back, okay, this is actually the process that's going on, then you can say that this is at the core of dialectics. And then you can also start to say, okay, there's certain aspects to this process. Well, certain, there's that one of negation, which leads to a different position, and then there's another negation. Maybe you have, so there you can start seeing those triplets suddenly appear. But I would advise against starting with like putting on your 3-step glasses and then reading a Hegel text. You will get totally lost. But just like try to forget about dialectics as much as you can, and then read Hegel. It's much more fruitful, I think.
Is there any end to this dialectical process, or is it this kind of infinity, kind of ongoing self-knowledge and disclosure of the world?
Oh no, yeah. So that Hegel is, if you like, a enemy of the idea of like an unending, a never-ending progress. He calls that bad infinity, and for Hegel, the idea would always be, and this is also somehow a Spinozist idea of an all-encompassing unity. The idea is that this structure is fulfilled or comes to its endpoint when it realizes its own structure. So you start out with a process of dialectics, if you like, okay, that involves this constant self-negation of thought, and through self-negation, a self-enrichment of thought, until the very point where thinking realizes what it has been doing, or what the underlying process and motivator or motor of its journey was all along. And so, if you like, self-knowledge in this very fundamental sense is the goal of the science of logic. Because then by understanding what you've been doing, you've also understood the structure of reality and the fundamental principle of reality, according to Hegel, at least.
Now that's very fascinating. I suppose now we've kind of conceptualized the I and how we're thinking and how the I thinks in the world. Perhaps we could turn a bit more about how in the very beginning you talked about how the I becomes a we, and how that then ties into spirit of some sort. Can you tell us a bit more about how that relationship develops in Hegel's thought about where does spirit arise?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I would like the way I try to or I like to explain it is by asking the questions. Well, but probably it's it's better if I explain how the relationship between the I and the we is to be thought, other than how it develops, maybe. Because again, then we would have to go back to the phenomenology, and so and when we speak of development for Hegel, it's not about like a real development in time. So he's not putting out there an empirical thesis, but it's like it's a conceptual relationship that he tries to develop. So
he's trying to explain something of what he's experiencing instead of trying to say this is how things are going to develop, or this is how.
Exactly. So he's not telling like a history of consciousness in the way that an empirical researcher would try to tell that. But so for Hegel, the idea that so when you ask someone, who are you, okay, so what then do you say? Okay, so if you're like a philosopher and you've read too much Fichte, or you think you want to be funny, you can say something like, I am I. Okay, and so why is that a joke? Because, well, everyone can say I am I, and it's not wrong, it's true. It's like that transcendental I that we all have according to Kant, and there seems to be something like the most abstract notion for what every person is an I, but it's really vacant. It's empty. Okay, so you say I am I, and I say I am I, but I want to know who you are. Okay, so what then do you say? Okay, you say, then you might start giving me natural qualities of yourself. You might say, well, okay, I have black or dark hair, or I say, well, I used to be blonde. I have brown hair now. I'm white. I think I have gray eyes or something like that, and I'm, I think, 1.75 meters. I don't know what that is in inches or feet, or even how you measure that. but then with such an answer, you would say, that's kind of strange. What is he talking about? That's really not what I wanted to know when I ask, who is he? Who are you? And so, well, what do we say? Well, you say, I'm a philosopher. I'm a father. I'm German citizen. And then you say what you do. Well, I'm a Catholic. Okay. You say things like these to really substantiate who that I is that encompasses all those things. But what are all those things that I just said? Well, husband, father, philosopher. Well, philosopher, you could even debate that. But if you say I'm a professional philosopher, okay, you all these things are social roles that we occupy. So you inherently, to your understanding of who you are, you have a social perspective to that. Now, this is not precisely the way that Hegel develops this, but this is his, if you like, his point to take away, I would say, the conceptual point to take away. And that's why it's easiest to explain in this way, that to have a substantive answer to the question, who am I as an individual, I have to refer to social, and that is non-individual roles and institutions. And suddenly now, if you like, if you want to put it in this bad scheme of dialectics, you could say, well, there's I, and then there's the individual, and then there's society. So thesis and antithesis, and the synthesis is then seeing that both are not, independent of each other, or something like that. Okay, well, it's true. It's not how Hegel develops this, but if you like, okay. But the point is just the notion of an individual, a substantive notion of an individual, is inherently social. And it's not even paradoxical. It just sounds paradoxical, but that's how things are. And so actually you have to have a notion of institutions, of social roles, to have a substantive theory of self-consciousness that is more than just a formal analysis of how self-reference works. And so this is the way that Hegel connects self-consciousness to the we, and to something like a spirit. So I think even in English you can say something like a team spirit, right? Right. Not Nirvana's teen spirit, but team spirit. Okay. And in German also Mannschaftsgeist. So the German word for spirit is Geist, ghost. Okay. So but you don't mean by that kind of team spirit. It's a strange thing. As team spirit, it's not like it's an extra entity there, but it's it's just the sum of the individuals that it's there. It's somehow, well, what is it? It's a certain unity which which arises from the roles that everyone plays within a group, but also the spirit makes possible then certain individual characteristics, which you see all the time. You take one player out of one team and you put him into another team, and all of a sudden he sucks, or he's great all of a sudden, and it's the same player. Okay, so this is not something that this analogy is not something that Hegel uses, but something that I like to use to break it down to a more everyday phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. And is it possible to think about numerous spirits going on at the same time in Hegel? I suppose you'd give the example of, I suppose, a team spirit. There seems to be numerous different teams. There's like a football team, and there's these different worlds in which these spirits are engaging in. Mm-hmm. Is it reasonable to look at Hegel and say there's equally as many of these kind of individual spirits which then fit into a broader spirit? Or is there just one kind of all-encompassing spirit?
Yeah, those are like all, well, you could say, if you say spirit as such, you mean a certain we structure that I tried to sketch roughly. But then you could also say, well, these are certain different manifestations of spirit or forms of spirit. You could talk like that. But then of course, yes, you would also have like this this nesting relationship probably of individuals within social roles, and social roles within larger social roles, and so on. And for Hegel, at least within the social sphere, the largest one is then the state, okay, or the nation, you could say, or just a polis, whatever word you would like to use, okay, just some political community. And the political community is like the largest we group of a substantive manner that we have, according to Hegel. Now you could say, well, why not the world? Okay, well, and Hegel would say, well, then again, it's become somehow vacuous, because that's pretty much that's as close as you can get to the, well, I am I. Okay, we are all one. Okay, so it's again, you need some form of difference and also opposition to have like a substantive and meaningful understanding of I and also of we. So that's why Hegel also thought that like a world state, that's a strange idea. That would not even be a state. That would be like the end of statehood, if you like, if there would be just one giant global, I don't know, community. For Hegel, it would not even be a community in a political sense. So that is that we. But then, of course, you could even move higher up and say, okay, there is a certain dimension on which like different political communities interact, and also they arise and then they disappear, and that's history. And for Hegel, okay, there's world spirit moving in history. So there, which he says, really world spirit. And world spirit, then, if you like, is again that understanding of what we said is the concept in that metaphysical sense, showing itself in history. And also it's so therefore, and if you, once you see that, and you see that like freedom is, Hegel understands as a self-determination. Self-determination he understands as the core of the what he calls the concept. And then again, he sees that as the core of world history. Then you see all of a sudden, okay, obviously world history has to be for Hegel the unfolding of freedom. And this is exactly what he claims. He does not say that this works just like without any problems or back, or some backtracking or even catastrophes. But all in all, he says, if you look at human history, it's also the development of the understanding of what freedom is. This is his actual his actual quotation. So he does not say it's a development of freedom, but the insight into freedom. And we could say, well, to a certain degree, have human beings understood more correctly what freedom is? Well, it depends. Some would say with the French Revolution, we have started misunderstanding what freedom is. But Hegel is a critic, so that would be a topic of its own. Hegel and the French Revolution. He's an admirer and a harsh critic of it at the same time. Okay, so this is again, world spirit is probably, if you like, the largest perspective he has.
That's quite fascinating, and I suppose with spirit as well, it has been interpreted in a lot of different ways, especially in the 19th century. A lot of people are like right Hegelians or left Hegelians. Some people took the spirit in a more secular context, and we can see how that can be interpreted in a secular context, whereas other times people look at that and think of it in maybe a more Christian context or a metaphysical context. Can you perhaps, let's talk a bit more about the Christian metaphysical side of things first, and maybe tell us a bit more about what exactly was this metaphysical or religious concept of spirit, and is that a proper or correct way to understand Hegel's presentation of spirit?
Yeah. So first of all, yeah, you're correct. This opposition between left Hegelians and right Hegelians is originally not a political one, but it's a division that came about through different interpretations of his philosophy of religion. And then, of course, since religion and politics hang together, this also became a political divide in those who followed Hegel or had followed Hegel. So Christianity, well, Hegel is is full. His work is full of references to Christianity and Christian theology, especially to the Trinity, and so you could get the impression that Hegel is a Christian philosopher when you read him on a surface level, if you like. And even if you read him more deeply, you could say, well, he's obviously Christian because, well, I ended with world spirit, but I said it's the highest form of spirit. Well, highest form of spirit on this political level, if you like. But then there is also what Hegel calls absolute spirit. And the idea of absolute spirit is, again, a form of a kind of self-referentiality. So forms of spirit, so forms of weak consciousness, if you like, that that reflect on themselves. Okay, so a form of collective self-reflection, if you like. And for Hegel, this happens in the arts. This happens in religion, and on the very highest level, this is philosophy, where spirit thinks about itself. Okay, in art, spirit presents itself in a sensual or represents itself in a spiritual manner, or manifests itself in a it manifests itself in a sensual manner. And in religion, Hegel says, well, in religion, spirit works with imagination or mental pictures or metaphors or something like that. Vorstellungsbilder, Vorstellungen, he says in German. And so religion is already very high up in his philosophical system, if you like. It's just one step below like philosophy, and religion is for Hegel thus something that is necessary for human life. It is a form of as an anthropological constant. And not all religions are the same for Hegel. Rather, Christianity for Hegel is the highest form of religion. It's the religion of freedom. It's the religion where, man first understands himself to be free, to be a person, also to be somehow divine or made in the image of God. And that and understanding that this means that he's rational or tied to rationality itself, that he is oriented towards the good, and all these things. So in this sense, he's a defender of Christianity. But then if you again look even deeper into his philosophy of religion, I think you have to come to terms with the fact that Hegel is not a theist in any traditional sense. So he's not a classical theist. And this is the case because for Hegel, God is not ontologically independent of the world. So, I mean, on classical theism, as it's the root of Christianity, I mean, and as it shows itself, especially in the idea of creatio ex nihilo, of a creation from nothing. Hegel cannot agree with this because this would undermine his understanding of the absolute, which is basically Spinozist, which means that Hegel thinks, well, if God were something independent from the world, like completely independent from the world, then, well, he would also this would make no sense, because this, if you were the other of the world, then there would be some form in which God is negated. Okay, but if he's negated in some sense, he is not truly infinite. This is, to be truly infinite, he must encompass that which is finite, and only then is he understood truly to be the absolute. And okay, this is something which a Christian I think cannot hold. And this becomes then practically clear in the way that Hegel speaks about prayer, for example. So for Hegel, prayer is, if you like, monologue or internal dialogue of reason, but it's not a person, a finite person, a creature speaking to his creator. This for Hegel does not make any sense. Also, petitionary prayer for Hegel is he cannot make sense of that concept, and you can already see if you put these aspects of his philosophy into religion into focus, then he's very close already to than what Ludwig Feuerbach then later in his philosophy of religion develops, namely the claim that, well, theology is just externalized anthropology, if you like. And Hegel was reluctant to draw this conclusion. He even received a letter from Feuerbach about this, but Hegel was not either able or willing to say this explicitly. And so he would always say, no, of course I'm a theist, and there is he didn't use the word theist or theist, but he was clear, of course, I mean God and also creation, and he did use all those vocabularies, and Christianity, I defend all of those things. But when you look into how he actually understands and explains those concepts, you see that they're not actually compatible with Orthodox Christianity, at least I would say. Yeah, so that is I think the correct way to look at Hegel, but he always tried to be on the fence about it, and this is also the reason why then you have those two sides, the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians, right after Hegel's death, fighting over whether you can be a Christian or you cannot be a Christian while remaining a Hegelian. Yeah.
So I suppose there's two questions that follow from that, which are quite fascinating, I suppose, help clarify this conception of spirit. I mean, firstly, in framework to Spinoza, would you say in some sense that this Hegelian idea of spirit actually ends up being almost identical to a Spinoza kind of, I guess, the criticisms of panentheism and whatnot? Do those criticisms then actually apply to Hegel as well? Are those metaphysics quite similar?
So with regard to God, I would say yes. Whether it's panentheism or pantheism, I mean, Hegel did address the charge of pantheism, and he addressed it, I think, by making somewhat of a straw man out of this attack, because Hegel said, well, pantheism would mean to claim that every finite thing is God, which is ridiculous, because obviously finite things are just finite, and God is infinite, and so this is not it. But that's really, I think, a straw man of what is meant when we say that Hegel was a pantheist or a panentheist, because what we mean is exactly that Hegel believes that all finite things are the manifestations of a process which is not identifiable with any one or set of finite things, but which is the generative principle behind all of them, ontologically generative principle behind all of them, and which is to be called divine. And I think this is Hegel's position, actually. So in the end, I think if you spell out correctly what you mean by the charge of pantheism and panentheism, I would say that Hegel deserves that label, as well as Spinoza did. But maybe we don't have to use those labels. I think it's enough to say, well, Hegel does not. There is no room for the creator God as Christianity, like a creator God that is not dependent on his creation in any sense, that could have just as well not created the world and still be just as perfect as he is. This idea is incompatible with Hegel's metaphysics, I'd say.
And the second clarifying question is in relationship to Feuerbach. So, I mean, you talk about how Feuerbach views theology as just this externalized anthropology. And I was wondering whether Hegel's idea of spirit is in some sense, is very similar to, could be interpreted in a purely Feuerbachian lens, and that the only disagreement was that Hegel did indeed believe that there was something more than just, I guess, humans to humans, I suppose, whereas Feuerbach was like, well, everything is just humans and that's it all the way down.
Oh yeah, this is very that's you put it nicely. So I think for Hegel there's always like a there's always one aspect in Hegel's philosophy that Feuerbach would not be able and willing to go along with. So for him, theology is externalized anthropology. Okay, but he would say, okay, fine, but anthropology is also externalized theology, in the sense that humans really are divine, and that there is something, there is spirit, and you cannot identify spirit with any finite human being or any finite set or collective of them, and so on. And so this always gets tricky. But then if you like, so it's very difficult as a reader of Hegel in these questions to I think to find a satisfying answer. But now this is just my interpretation, or probably just the difficulties that I had through all the years. At one moment it makes sense and it seems like a smart comeback or answer, but after a while you think, well, it's like trying to nail a pudding to the wall, I tend to think that Feuerbach was really just more, I don't know, intellectually honest is probably to put it very harshly or too harshly, but just more, he took the Hegel's philosophy of religion really to its logical extreme, I think. So I think there is indeed Feuerbach is the logically necessary almost consequence of thinking in a Hegelian manner about religion.
And that is definitely a very fascinating analysis of Feuerbach as well as of Hegel. And we've covered a lot of what Hegel has said in this interview. And perhaps slowly racking up this interview, if you're thinking back at Hegel and someone wants to get into Hegel and wants to read, where exactly should they start with Hegel? It seems like Phenomenology of Spirit might not actually be the best place to go into.
Don't do that, exactly.
Where should you start?
Don't do that. So there is a small essay by Hegel, which is in German is called "Who Thinks?" Wer denkt abstrakt, and in English would be something like "Who thinks abstractly," or "Who thinks in an abstract manner." I don't know if it is translated into English or how, but I'm sure it must be translated into English. So if you can find it in English, or if you read German, then you should read it in German, obviously. But that's quite an interesting text, because you can read it and you can understand it like the first time you read it, and then there's more to it. And that's quite different from all other Hegelian texts, because you don't understand them the first time you read them. And there he explains somewhat, with a few also funny examples, he explains how people tend to say that philosophers think abstractly. They're so abstract. And Hegel says, oh, no. Philosophical thinking is concrete and everyday thinking is abstract. Why? Because everyday thinking always just looks at reality from a certain vantage point, from a certain perspective, like seeing a criminal being led away to his hanging and then saying, oh, that he's a murderer, which is correct, but he has probably more things you could also say about him. Or even if you look, oh, it's a flower. Well, you could say, well, it's a flower. It's a sign of love. It's worth a certain amount of money. So there's many different aspects you can always look at one and the same thing. And in our everyday understanding, we always just typically choose one and identify that aspect with the whole thing. And Hegel says, well, philosophy is actually bringing together those very many aspects of reality and combining them, and that is concrete thinking, and that's why philosophers think concretely, and everyday thinking is abstract. So I like that one, and it's very interesting, and you get to know a little bit of Hegel's thinking. But then, if you're ready to, truly read his more important texts, then it depends on your interests. I think certainly the science of logic is regarding metaphysics is most important work, and also a lot more manageable than the phenomenology. But it's tough to get into it if you really don't have an idea of Hegel. So if you really don't understand anything about Hegel, maybe it's even better to start with something that is has more, I would say, empirical content to it, like the philosophy of right, where he develops his not only his philosophy of jurisprudence or of rights, but also of his more or less his ethics and his political philosophy. His philosophy of aesthetics. So he has lectures on aesthetics, which are quite instructive, and you don't even have to know anything about the logic. You just like by reading that book, you learn a lot about the way that Hegelian metaphysics works, and when you're somehow informed or pre-informed in that manner, then you turn to the science of logic. It might be easier for you then to understand that. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And I suppose another question that people might be getting into, I remember when I was talking to a good friend who does a lot of reading on Hegel, I was like, where should I start? And he said, start with the commentaries instead. If someone was to go into some good commentaries for Hegel, where would they recommend to turn to?
Wow, there's so much stuff. Just so many publications, also, especially in recent years. I mean, when I started doing philosophy, people were like, Hegel, are you crazy? And now everyone's doing Hegel. Like even analytical philosophers are into Hegel, and so there's really tons of stuff, and so many different schools of thought. And sometimes you read two commentaries on Hegel, on one and the same work by Hegel, and you think it's impossible. They cannot have been like these two books could not have been written about the same book, because they give such a different understanding. So yeah, that it's really tough. But I think the best general introduction maybe to Hegel, I think this one, by Stephen Houlgate, and it's called Freedom, Truth, and History: An Introduction to Hegel. And I think this is the second edition. I don't know if there's been another one since then, but so Houlgate is as orthodox of an Hegelian as you can be, which is a good thing, because he does not try to sugarcoat things and to make Hegelian more appealing to any anti-metaphysical sentiments that we might have or anything, but it's just like full force Hegel. And then if you're interested also in his, not just in his works, in his biography, I would just shamelessly plug my own book. If you read German, it has not been translated into English yet, and it's called Hegel der Weltphilosoph, Hegel the World Philosopher. So if you read German, I think that's I try to combine biography and an introduction into his thinking. But Houlgate is definitely the guy to go to. Also, when you're interested in the science of logic, there's a huge commentary by him. Also more coming up. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
That's very fascinating. And to end off this interview, we talk about how the science of logic and the encyclopedia are some of Hegel's main works. But it seems like when people think about Hegel, people always turn back to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Perhaps to end off this interview, how has Hegel been interpreted by philosophy, and what is his legacy in the world, but most notably in the world today?
Oh, okay. Wow, that's a huge question, because that's probably the most complicated question of this entire interview, because Hegel's legacy it's interesting. I think it's a legacy of misunderstandings, uh, like in so many ways. Like if I look today at what Hegel has been made responsible for, or even probably was responsible for, but not he himself, but his readers, uh, I'm terrified, to be honest. But I mean, I think for a long time the boogeyman of like politically liberal thought, or also of like logical analysis movements like that, like Popper, Karl Popper. I mean, he hated Hegel. I don't think he understood anything by Hegel. It's pure projection. But so he portrayed Hegel as this totalitarian thinker, and then of course with Russell you have then this view of just like metaphysical nonsense that is being produced by Hegel. And so I think these views have dominated. And now there's a certain also, I think, like interest stemming from also researchers and interest in Marx, like coming back to Hegel as, it's a precursor to Marx. And there's also like social critique and dialectics and all these notions, which again, I think people should rather stay with Marx if they're interested in that, because I think if they read Hegel honestly, they will not be happy with what they find there. So I would say so that I would say Hegel was not a left Hegelian. But I think those two. So I think that the Marxists and then all those different movements, Frankfurt School and so on, that developed out of Marxism or neo-Marxism, that then took up reading Hegel, are very dominant today. And at least if you look into practical philosophy. So I think that's Hegel's legacy, if he likes it or not. But not everyone gets the legacy he or she deserves. So that will be, I think, my short final statement on that question.
Yes, so I suppose even if Hegel didn't deserve the legacy he got, if any of us as philosophers or aspiring philosophers do end up being as quoted and as influential as Hegel, interpreted correctly or incorrectly, that is, I suppose, still a very good place to start. But anyhow, thank you so much for coming on to this channel to talk about Hegel. I'm sure that the audience have learned so much more about Hegel, to get into Hegel, to read his works, and have been facilitated by this interview. Thank you so much once again for coming on. Stay safe. And of course, as always, let me know your thoughts about Hegel, and of course, what you want to see in other videos in the comments below. Stay safe and God bless. I'll see you in the next one.